And so Diana's ready. So let's talk about PFAS.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to talk to you about per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFASs, today, but it's a very complex topic and I just have 10 minutes, so I'm going to be moving pretty quickly. So because of that, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me later and we can discuss more.
Yeah, Diana, we have extra time, so don't feel rushed.
Oh, okay, great.
All right.
So go ahead and can you guys see me okay? Someone said that they weren't able to see me. I have the video on, but I'm not sure if it's working. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So PFASs are human-made chemicals. There's currently more than 3,000 of them. They were originally manufactured starting in the 1950s, so they've been around for a while. They have very confusing taxonomy and nomenclature. And the basic idea is they're a chain of carbons with fluorines at each bonding site. And it's that carbon fluoride bond that really gives these chemicals both their usefulness and their problems. These chemicals also have a polar group at one end, usually a sulfonate or a carboxylate, but other chemical moieties are possible. And so it makes them polar chemicals, but they're also both hydrophilic and lipophilic, which really provides some interesting chemical properties that account for, again, their usefulness and their problems. So they move easily through water. They're mobile, they're very persistent. That carbon fluoride bond is very strong, so they don't break down easily, and they are generally bioaccumulative. Some of them, depending on the particular chemistry, may not be as bioaccumulative as others. And it really, their fate and transport and toxicity is all intertwined with both the length of the carbon chain and that functional group at the end. So that's going to determine your fate and transport and the toxicity. And just to note, two of the chemicals are the most well studied and are talked about the most. That's PFOS and PFOA. And we'll talk a little more about them moving forward. So go ahead, next slide, please. So this slide just highlights the environmental challenges of these chemicals. They're highly persistent. They are very mobile, they have high toxicity, and they have a very complicated remediation, which really makes them difficult. Go ahead, next slide. So where are they coming from in the environment? So these chemicals are used in any kind of waterproof or stain-resistant agents. So most well known for being in Teflon, also in aqueous film forming firefighting foam, which is really prevalent at military bases and airports and anywhere else where firefighting training occurs. They're in waterproof clothing. They're in personal care products. They are lining to-go products like fiberboard containers, as seen in the photo here. They're also in any kind of stain or grease resistant textiles like couches or carpeting. And then we also see, because they're in all these personal products, we see them in wastewater treatment plants and landfills where they're basically accumulating from the disposal of regular life. And fortunately, we don't have any manufacturing of these chemicals in Hawaii. The manufacturing plants have notoriously on the mainland been a site of significant contamination, but we are fortunate that we don't have those here. In addition, a little bit of a strange use, but sometimes found particularly on military bases and industrial areas, is it's used in chrome plating as a mister to keep, to help with the chrome plating process. So that's another source of significant contamination. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a schematic that gives some information about how these chemicals end up in the environment. And so they start out, whether it's the disposal or use of consumer products or other industrial discharges, or directly used in the environment, such as firefight with AFFF. And then they end up in wastewater treatment plants, in the landfills, and also just directly in the environment. And then they move next into both surface water, groundwater, soil, crops, and really anywhere else you can imagine. Now, drinking water has primarily been the biggest concern to date of these chemicals, which we'll talk more about in a moment. And it's important to remember that wastewater treatment plants, that these chemicals are not removed in standard wastewater treatment. Okay, next slide. So this is a conceptual site model that I really like that shows some of the ideas of how these chemicals are getting into our different environmental media through landfills and wastewater treatment. So if you look at the landfill schematics, unlined landfills, they can just leach directly into groundwater or soil. A lined landfill may be in, these chemicals may be in the leachate, but then that goes to the wastewater treatment plant and into the effluent. And now remember, in Hawaii, a lot of our effluent is going straight out into the ocean. So there is going to be the release of these chemicals from the wastewater treatment plant effluent. It can, of course, get into the drinking water from the groundwater and aquifer, and biosolids from wastewater treatment plants that are then applied to land can then get the chemicals into crops, soils, and there have even been reports of it getting into cow's milk at dairy. Okay, next slide. So talking about PFAS and human health, this is a really extensive and controversial topic, but the main thing to know is that there's universal presence, at least in Americans. So in NHANES, which is the National Health Survey that's done with biomonitoring across the country, they started looking for PFOS and PFOA a number of years ago, and they find that greater than 99% of Americans tested in the NHANES survey have these chemicals in their blood. Most of the research and what we know about the health effects really come from pretty significant levels of exposure through drinking water or workers at the manufacturing plants. And the health effects really vary with the chemistry, and we don't really know we really don't have any data on the extensive array of these chemicals. Most of what we know is about PFOS and PFOA. And so some of the things that have been found in studies of these chemicals are associations with developmental problems, increased cholesterol, immune system alterations, the thyroid, and then certain types of cancer, particularly testicular and pancreatic cancer. And there has also some liver issues and a number of other possible health effects as well. This is only the tip of the iceberg, as we have very little data about the ecological risks of these chemicals. And again, very few have been studied. So when we think about humans being exposed to these, drinking water in many places is the highest exposure concern. But there's also concern for fish consumption, produce that has been watered or grown in soil contaminated with PFAS, and just direct contamination to food from to-go boxes and other waterproof chemicals. There's also growing concern that these can be emitted from the air and have emissions that way that can then contaminate large environmental areas, but research into that is definitely still ongoing. Okay, next slide, please. So what about in Hawaii? And I think it's really important to think about our potential exposures in Hawaii. So we are fortunate, no manufacturing, so that's a great sign. As of now, we don't have known drinking water contamination with PFAS. So UCMR 3, which was the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Program in 2013 to 2015, evaluated public drinking water systems for 6 PFAS, and we did not have any hits in Hawaii. So we're very excited about that, which is great. More testing is planned, and the next UCMR coming out, I believe it's starting next year, is planned to have many more PFAS to be evaluated as well. So when we think about our sources here in Hawaii, we're looking at our military bases, our firefighting training sites, airports, wastewater treatment plants, and landfills. And fortunately, most of these are below the UIC line, so that goes along with a lower risk of contamination of our aquifer. which is fortunate, but it does, most of these have some either closeness or relation to the ocean. So the contamination in the nearshore environment is a high concern. As far as sites that have been tested in Hawaii, so far, very few. There are a couple of sites at Pearl Harbor, a former landfill site, and they've also done some testing at the Lahaina Airport in Maui, which is showing signs of PFAS in the groundwater, and this is also very close to the ocean. Next slide. So what are we doing at DOH to evaluate PFAS contamination in Hawaii? Currently in the works of two particular studies. The first is looking at fish and the nearshore environment and water in the nearshore environment. So we chose 14 sites around Oahu, 11 of which we consider high risk based on nearness to potential sources, and 3 control sites. We're studying fish. We collected fish from each site and co-located with passive water samplers that sat in the location for a month. And those results, we're waiting on the results of those from the lab. So the data on those should be back quite soon. And then we're also looking at the overall fish consumption. So we are looking at market bought fish as well, and want to evaluate that. This is a collaboration with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Hawaii Pacific University, and the United States Geological Survey. As I said, we're awaiting results, and this is funded by the EPA State Response Program. In addition, we're just getting started on a program looking at PFAS and multimedia, and this will look at wastewater treatment plants, influent and effluent, as well as biosolids, landfill leachate, and soils where the wastewater treatment plant effluent reuse water is used and biosolids are added as soil amendment. We hope to start in 2021 the sampling of this project, and it's funded by an EPA multi-purpose grant. Go ahead, next slide. So some regulatory issues. The biggest issue with PFAS is there's really lacking of universal standards. States are taking the lead, but they vary widely, and there's really more data needed, especially for non-PFOS and PFOA chemicals. Okay, next slide. So EPA put out a PFAS action plan in February 2019. It outlines the concrete steps the agency is taking to address PFAS and to protect public health, and it's really been criticized for not doing enough. Next slide. And some of the activities the EPA has in process right now related to this is they're evaluating the need for an MCL for drinking water for PFOA and PFOS. They're looking at designating these chemicals as hazardous substances. They're clarifying groundwater cleanup recommendations and developing toxicity values for GenX and PFBS. Really want to point out the focus on PFOS and PFOA. I find that as to be something of concern, and we really need to expand the portfolio of and gather data more on these additional chemicals. Next slide. So what's happening with PFAS regulatory action in Hawaii? We have some brand new news of newly released environmental action levels about PFAS. And for that, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Dr. Roger Brewer, to talk about that. And my email is up here. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. That was a lot of information in a few short minutes, and there's a lot more to discuss about this very complex topic. Thank you for having me.